You know that feeling when you are standing in front of a mirror and you do not recognize the person looking back at you. Not because something went wrong with the reflection, but because for the very first time in your entire life, the reflection is finally right. That is where this story ends. But let me take you back to where it begins, because the beginning, I promise you, is something you will not be able to look away from. My name is Aryan. Or at least, that is what everyone called me for 23 years. And for 23 years I smiled at that name, answered to it, wore it like a uniform, like a costume, like a mask so tightly pressed to my face that I forgot what my actual face even looked like underneath. I was the son. The only son. The pride. The future. The one who was supposed to carry the family name forward like a torch held high against the dark. And I carried it. God, I carried it so hard that my hands burned. Let me paint you a picture of my childhood home. A middle-class house in a mid-sized city where the walls were thin and the expectations were thicker than the walls. My father was the kind of man who believed that strength meant silence. That love meant duty. That a son was not just a child but a statement to the world that you had done something right. And my mother, she was soft in the way that only people who have been made hard for too long can be soft. She would hum while she cooked. She would fold her cerise with this careful, deliberate tenderness that I used to watch from the doorway when she did not know I was there. I used to watch her for a long time. I did not understand why, back then. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I was just bored. I told myself a lot of things that children tell themselves when the truth is too enormous to fit inside a small chest. The first time I touched one of her dupattas, I was 7 years old. She had left it draped over the back of a chair in the bedroom, this soft peacock blue thing with little silver threads running through it. I remember the house was empty. My father was at work. My mother had gone to the neighbor's house. And I walked into that bedroom for a reason I still cannot fully explain, and I picked up that dupatta, and I just held it for a second. And then, without thinking, without deciding, I wrapped it around my shoulders. And something happened inside me that I had no language for. It was not excitement in the way children get excited about toys or sweets. It was something quieter and deeper. Like a door in a room you have lived in your whole life suddenly swinging open and you realize there was a room behind it all along. I stood in front of my mother's dressing mirror with that dupatta around my shoulders and I looked at myself and the word that came to my 7-year-old mind was right. Not strange. Not wrong. Right. And then I heard the gate outside creak. I ripped the dupatta off my shoulders so fast that I nearly knocked over the dressing table. My heart was beating like something trapped inside a box. I folded it badly, worse than I had found it, and I ran to my room and sat on my bed with my school textbook open to a page I was not reading for the next 45 minutes until my mother walked in and asked me if I wanted tea. That was the first secret. Secrets have a way of growing. You plant one tiny seed of something you are not supposed to feel and you try to bury it deep and water it with shame and pile guilt on top of it like stones. But it grows anyway. It grows through the stones. It grows toward whatever light it can find. By the time I was 11, the secret had roots. I became very good at timing. At knowing when the house would be empty. At knowing which of my mother's things were where. I never took anything outside the house. I never let anyone see. I would slip into her room for 10, 15 minutes at the most, try on a bangle, hold up a piece of cloth to my face, sit with this feeling that I had no name for, and then put everything back exactly as I had found it and go back to being Aryan, the son, the good boy, the future of the family. School was its own performance. I was not unpopular. I was decent at cricket. I could talk to boys the way boys are supposed to talk to boys. I knew all the right things to say and all the right faces to make. I was so good at performing Aryan that sometimes I almost believed I was him completely. Almost. There were moments. Small fractures in the performance. Moments when a girl in my class would wear something and I would feel not attraction exactly but something more like longing. Not longing for her. Longing for what she had, what she was allowed to be. Longing for the ease with which she moved through the world in her own skin. I would look at her and think, what is that like? What is it like to be seen as what you actually are? I pushed those thoughts down so fast and so hard that I got very good at not feeling them at all. For stretches of time. Months sometimes. I would be just fine. Just normal. Just Aryan. And then something would crack it open again. A song. A smell. A certain quality of afternoon light. And there it would be, that feeling, patient as anything, waiting. By the time I was 16 I had a word for it. Not the whole truth yet, just one corner of it. The word was crossdressing, and I had found it on the internet in a way that felt criminal at the time, hunched over the computer at midnight with the brightness turned all the way down, reading words on a screen that described exactly, precisely, perfectly what I had been doing alone in my room for years. And I felt two things simultaneously. The first was relief so enormous it almost made me cry. The second was terror so deep it almost made me sick. Because if there was a word for it, then it was real. And if it was real, then I had to figure out what to do with it. I chose to do nothing with it. That is the thing nobody tells you about secrets. The longer you keep them, the more of you they start to occupy. My secret by the time I was 16 was not a small thing anymore. It was a significant portion of who I was, existing entirely underground, unseen, unspoken, growing in the dark. And everything above ground, the Aryan that everyone saw, had to be maintained even more carefully because the gap between what was above and what was below kept getting wider. I threw myself into being the sun. I studied. I got good marks. I joined the school cricket team even though I was not that passionate about it because it made my father proud, and my father's pride was like oxygen in our house, necessary and hard to come by. I talked about engineering college because that was what was expected. I said all the right things at dinner. I made my parents happy in all the ways I knew how to. And privately, secretly, in the small dark hours when the house was fully asleep, I would sit with the part of me I was starving. I want you to understand something. This is not a story about weakness. This is not a story about someone who was broken or confused or lost. This is a story about someone who was extraordinarily, exhaustingly strong, for years, in the wrong direction. Holding yourself together in a shape you are not meant to be is one of the hardest things a human being can do. And I did it. I did it well. And it cost me more than I have words for. College was a different world. I went to an engineering college 2 cities away from home, and for the first time in my life I had a room of my own with a door that locked. And I want to tell you that I immediately became free. But that is not what happened. What happened is that I stared at that locked door for 3 weeks before I did anything with it. Because freedom, when you have never had it, is terrifying. You have spent so long being what others need you to be that when no one is watching, you do not know what to do with yourself. The first thing I bought with my own money, my own carefully saved pocket money, was a simple cotton curtain from a women's section of a clothing store. I bought it online. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I added it to the cart. I remember triple-checking the address to make sure it would not be delivered to my home address. I remember the way my heart felt when the package arrived and I locked my door and opened it. I tried it on. And I sat on the edge of my bed and I just breathed for a while. That is all. I just breathed. Because the person in the mirror of the small bathroom in my college hostel room was looking back at me with this expression that I realized I had never seen on my own face before. Something like peace. Something like recognition. Something like coming home to a house you have never been to before but somehow always known the way to. I cried a little. Not sad tears. I do not know what kind of tears they were. Maybe the kind that come when something you have been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to put itself down. I was 19 years old. Over the next 2 years I built a very small, very private life alongside my regular life. I had a few items of women's clothing hidden in my bag, the kind that could pass for gender neutral if anyone happened to see them but that I knew the truth about. I watched videos online. I started understanding myself more. I found communities of people who felt what I felt, who had stories that rhymed with mine, and reading their words in the blue light of my phone screen at night was like being handed a glass of water after years of thirst. I was not alone. I had never been alone in this. There were so many of us, living these double lives, these parallel existences, performing one self for the world and keeping the other self alive somehow in whatever small spaces we could find. But here is the thing about small spaces. They are never big enough forever. I came home for the summer between my 2nd and 3rd year of college, and within 48 hours of being back in my parents' house I felt the walls close in. Not literally. But that sense of the mask going back on, of squeezing myself back into the shape of Aryan the sun, of watching my father look at me with this pride that was real and warm and entirely based on a version of me that was only partly true. It hurt in a way I had not expected. Because I loved my father. I love him. That is the part of these stories that people on the outside often miss. This is not a story about a cruel family that someone needed to escape. This is a story about love, love complicated by truth, love that I was terrified would not survive contact with who I actually was. My mother found something that summer. I had been careful. I thought I had been so careful. But I had a small pouch in my bag, a zipper pouch that I used to carry a few things when I came home, and inside it was a small simple thing, a thin glass bangle, just one, pale green, that I had kept because it made me feel something I could not throw away. And she was helping me unpack, the way mothers do when their sons come home, and she opened that pouch and she held up the bangle and she looked at it for a moment and then she looked at me. The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. I said nothing. I could not breathe. She looked at the bangle and then at me and then at the bangle again and then she said, very quietly, as if she were commenting on the weather, "This is pretty." And she put it back in the pouch and she handed the pouch to me and she went back to helping me unpack and we never spoke about it. Not that day. Not that summer. Not for a long time after. But she knew something. I knew she knew something. And the knowing sat between us like a third person in every room we shared that summer. Third year of college was the year I met Kovia. She was from the design department, loud and laughing and completely without the kind of self-consciousness that I had lived inside my entire life. She wore what she wanted, said what she thought, took up exactly as much space as she needed and not a centimeter less. I was fascinated by her in the way that you are fascinated by someone who has something you desperately need but cannot name. We became friends the way you sometimes become friends with people who are opposite to you, gradually and then completely. It was Kovia who I told first. We were sitting on the roof of her hostel one night in October, second semester of third year, sharing a packet of chips and talking about nothing important, and then talking about something slightly more important. And then the conversation shifted in that way that late-night conversations sometimes shift, and I was talking about feeling like I was always performing, and she said, "What do you mean performing?" And I meant to give her a vague answer, and instead I heard myself say something real. I said, "I mean I feel like no one actually knows me. The real me. Because I have never shown anyone the real me." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "What is the real you?" And I said nothing for so long that the silence became its own answer. And then I told her. Not everything. Not all at once. In the way that you let water out of something that has been sealed for too long, carefully, testing each word before the next, watching her face for the thing I was terrified of seeing. Disgust. Confusion. Distance. The face of someone deciding to leave. She did not make any of those faces. She listened. She asked questions that were careful and real and not stupid. She said at one point, with total seriousness, "I always thought there was something you were not saying. Like a whole room in you with the door shut." And I laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes out of you when relief and sadness and joy all arrive at the same moment and cannot decide who goes first. Kovia became my person. My first real person who knew. And everything shifted because of that. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But the way that light shifts in a room when you open a window. Slowly, gradually, the whole quality of everything changes. She was the one who, months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in her room with the door locked and her roommate gone for the weekend, asked me if I wanted to. Not pressuring. Just asking. The way a real friend asks. She had a whole wardrobe of things she did not wear anymore, and she said, "You can try whatever you want, and I do not have to be here if you do not want me to be, and there is no pressure," and I said, "No, stay. I want you to stay." That afternoon. I do not know how to tell you about that afternoon without making you feel some part of what it felt like. I stood in front of Kovia's full-length mirror with a simple cotton salwar kameez on, pale yellow, her oldest one, soft from so many washes, and she had tied my hair back because it was long enough by then. I had been growing it out without quite admitting to myself why, and she stepped back and she looked at me and she said, quietly, "Oh. Just oh." And then she smiled. And I looked in the mirror. I looked in the mirror for a long time. And the person looking back at me was the closest I had ever come, in 21 years on this earth, to looking at myself. I do not have a word big enough for that moment. I have tried to find one and I cannot. I can only tell you that something in me that had been very tightly wound for a very long time became, quietly, a little less wound. Something in me exhaled. And I did not cry this time. I just looked. And then I smiled. Not a performed smile, not an Aryan smile, just a smile that came from somewhere underneath everything. Kavya said, "You look like yourself." And that is the truest thing anyone had ever said to me. But here is where the story stops being simple, because simple is not what real life gives you. I went home that December for the winter break and I sat at the dinner table with my parents, and my father told me he had started talking to some people about job placements after I graduated, and my mother served food and refilled plates and hummed something under her breath, and I sat there feeling the full weight of everything. Because I loved them. Because I wanted them to know me. Because I was terrified that if they knew me, that love would have conditions attached to it that I did not know I could meet. My father said, "You are quiet tonight." I said, "I am tired from the journey." He nodded and accepted that and went back to telling me about the placements, and I sat there behind my face and thought, how long? How long can I do this? How many dinners? How many nodded agreements? How many years of being half a person in the place where I should have been most whole? The answer that came back was not long. Not much longer. It was not a dramatic decision. It was not one big moment of courage. It was more like something that had been slowly becoming inevitable finally arriving. Like watching a door swing open in slow motion and knowing you were always going to walk through it. It was always just a matter of when. I spent the last semester of college doing two things. I was finishing my engineering degree, writing my final project, doing all the things that Aryan the sun was supposed to do. And simultaneously, privately, I was having long conversations with myself about what I owed the people I loved and what I owed myself, and whether those two things could exist in the same world. I talked to Kavya almost every day. She never pushed. She never had a plan for me. She just listened and asked good questions and trusted me to find my own way. That trust was its own kind of gift. I also, for the first time, started writing. Not for anyone to read. Just for myself. I had a plain notebook and I wrote in it every night, writing out all the things I had never been able to say out loud, writing the history of Aryan and the history of the person underneath Aryan and the story of how they had coexisted for so long in the same body and what it had cost. Writing is the thing that makes the formless have form. Writing it down made it real in a way that even Kavya knowing had not quite made it real. There it was on the page. My actual life. Not the performed version. The actual one. And then I graduated. And I came home. And on the third night home, after dinner, when my father had gone to watch the news and my mother was washing dishes in the kitchen, I walked into the kitchen and I stood next to her and I picked up a dish towel and I started drying dishes beside her, and we worked in silence for a little while, and then I said, "Amma." She said, And I said, "I need to tell you something. Something real. And I need you to just let me say it before you say anything back." She turned off the tap. She turned to look at me. And her face was the face of a mother who already knew that whatever was coming was something that had been on its way for a long time. I told her. I told her about being 7 years old and the Japata. I told her about the years of hiding and the years of performing and what it had cost me to keep that performance going. I told her about what I felt when I was allowed to simply be, without pretending. I told her that I was not asking her to understand it all at once, that I did not even understand all of it myself, but that I needed her to know. That I could not keep having dinners in that house, being loved for a version of me that was only partly there. She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen felt very small. Then she said, "The bangle. In your bag. That summer." I said yes. She was quiet again. And then she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, "I used to wonder when you would find the courage to tell me." I stared at her. I said, "You knew?" She said, "I knew something. I did not know what. But mothers know their children. Even when they do not know the specific truth, they know that something is being kept. And I used to pray that whatever it was, you would find a way to bring it to me instead of carrying it alone." I was crying by that point. Not elegant crying. The real kind. And my mother put her dish towel down and she held me the way she had not held me since I was a child, and she said, "You are my child." That is not a thing that changes. My father was harder. I will not tell you it was easy because it was not, and I will not pretend it was clean because it was not clean. There were weeks of difficulty. Weeks of my father barely looking at me. Weeks of conversations that went in circles and ended badly and had to be started again. He was a man of a certain generation with a certain set of expectations, and having those expectations questioned was like having the floor he stood on questioned. It was genuinely hard. It was painful for both of us. But here is what I know about my father. Underneath the silence and the difficulty and the weeks of struggling, there was the man who had been at every single one of my school events, who had driven 2 hours to pick me up when I was sick in college, who had told me once, just once, when I was maybe 14, that he did not care what I became as long as I was a person who was true. He had meant it as career advice. He had no idea he was giving me a permission I would not use for 9 more years. But he had said it. I reminded him of it. One evening when we were alone and the conversation was going badly again, I said, "You told me once to be a person who is true. That is what I am trying to do." He did not say anything. He looked at me for a long time. And then he got up and he went to his room. And I thought, that was the wrong thing to say. But 2 days later he came and sat with me in the evening and he said, "I am trying. I need time. But I am trying." That was everything. That was actually everything. Kovia came to visit a few weeks later. She and I went shopping. Real shopping, not hiding, not pretending, not online orders to a secret address. We walked into an actual store and I looked at actual things, and a shop girl asked if she could help and I said yes. "I'm looking for a curtain for myself, something in a green or a blue," and she nodded and showed me options, and the world did not end. Nobody stared dramatically. Nobody made a scene. The shop girl showed me 3 options and I tried one on in the fitting room, and I came out and showed Kovia and she tilted her head and said the blue one, definitely the blue, and I agreed and I bought it. We ate lunch after and Kovia was laughing about something and I was laughing too, and at some point in the middle of the laughing I stopped and I just noticed it. The feeling of being outside, in public, in myself, with a friend, having lunch and laughing. I noticed it the way you notice something that should have always been unremarkable but isn't, not yet, not quite. It was extraordinary precisely because it was ordinary. That ordinary thing, that lunch, that laugh, that blue curtain in a bag by my feet, it had cost me 23 years of getting here. The journey is not over. I want to be clear about that. There are still hard days. There are still conversations that have not happened yet. There are still people in my life who do not know, people I am not yet sure how to tell, moments when the old fear comes back like weather and I have to remind myself of what I know now, that being real is harder than being hidden, but it is so much less exhausting, so much less lonely, so much more like being alive. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved neatly. Real life does not do that. My father is still finding his way. Some relatives are in the dark and may stay there for a while. There are professional questions I have not answered yet about how I move through the world and who I am in different contexts. These are real and ongoing. I am not standing on the other side of everything hard. I am standing somewhere in the middle, having done the first enormous impossible thing and knowing that the path forward exists even if I cannot see all of it. But here is what I know. Here is the thing I want to leave you with if you are listening to this and something in it sounds familiar. If you recognize some part of this in yourself, if you have been keeping your own version of this kind of secret, in whatever form it takes. The weight of hiding is heavier than any consequence of being found. I spent 23 years afraid of what would happen if people knew. I imagined every terrible outcome. I ran every worst-case scenario. And none of them, none of the real outcomes, not even the hard ones with my father, not even the awkward ones, not even the painful ones, none of them were as heavy as the weight of the hiding. The hiding will exhaust you in ways that nothing else ever will. It will hollow out the parts of you that should be fullest. It will make you a brilliant performer and an invisible person. You deserve to be a visible person. You deserve to be seen by the people who love you. And the ones who truly love you, the ones who are worth the truth, they will find a way. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not without difficulty. But love that is real has more room in it than you think. My mother held me in the kitchen and said she had been waiting for me to find the courage. My father said he was trying. Kovia walked with me into a store and helped me pick a blue curtain. These things happened. They were not guaranteed. I could not have known they would happen. But they happened because I gave them the chance to happen. I stopped hiding. And for the first time in 23 years, the person in the mirror was someone I recognized. My name, the name I carry inside me now, the one that was always there under the other name, the one that fits, is mine. I do not have to share it with you today. But I know what it is. And knowing it, just knowing it privately and truly and without shame, is the beginning of something I do not yet have a word for, but I know with everything I have, is right. I am not Aryan the sun performing for a world that needed him to be a certain thing. I am something truer than that. Something that took 23 years to reach the surface. Something that the light is just now reaching for the first time. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own hiding, if you are reading this or hearing this at midnight with your screen turned down and your heart going too fast, I want you to know that the door you are afraid of is not a wall. It only feels like one. On the other side of it is air. On the other side of it is the possibility of being known. On the other side of it is the chance, just the chance, to stand in front of a mirror and finally recognize yourself. That chance is worth everything it costs. I know, because I paid it, and I would pay it again.